Any horse can develop a fracture from a direct blunt force trauma, such as a fall or a kick. But in your working athletic horse, the most common pathway to fracture formation is usually overuse and fatigue of the bone. So how does this happen? Well, to understand that, you have to look at the normal equine bone and how it adapts to exercise. So your typical equine long bone is a relatively rigid tubular structure, but that can actually bend to a little degree, a mild degree, a bit like our pen here. You know, when pressure is applied to it, a little bit of bend is present. And that's true of a property known as viscoelasticity, or a certain amount of plasticity or flexibility of the bone. And that's important to the bone because when forces are applied to it, its ability through weight bearing or any athletic pursuits, it does not want to absorb all of that force because all of the energy that that force brings has to be released in some way. So if it can bend to a certain degree without causing any level of deformation or permanent change in the structure of the bone, then that energy can be avoided, released, without causing any damage to our bone. So while this might sound a bit strange, it's a technique that's adapted in other areas in our lives. We see it every day in modern high-rise building architecture, for instance. Those high-rise buildings, when an earthquake occurs and those forces are applied to it, we want that building to be able to move to a certain degree so that it doesn't have to absorb all the energy that the earthquake brings. If we went back to the old ways of building, where we just build these structures as strong as we can with as much concrete and steel as possible so that there's no flexibility in them, when the earthquake hits this building, all the energy has to be absorbed, and that energy has to be released from the forces of the tremors. And the only way to release it is through cracking, which can obviously lead to cracks in our foundation and stabilizing structures and subsequent building collapse. So going back to our horse's bone, the same rules apply. As we ask our horses to develop into their athletic activity, we're asking the bone to adapt to the forces, the new forces that we're putting on those bones. So the more we use the bone, the more that horse's bone will develop new bone and become a thicker bone, a denser bone. And the problem with becoming a thicker and denser bone is that it loses some of its ability to flex and bend and avoid the energy that's been applied to it. And so, as our horse goes forward, it will have to find a new way to release the energy that is coming from the forces of weight bearing and racing or eventing or any of those athletic pursuits that the horse is performing. And the only way that it can start to do that over time is to form little micro cracks in the bone, usually at the joint surface. And these micro cracks allow energy to be released. And while we don't want cracking to occur, obviously, micro cracks are not always our enemy, because when appropriate rest periods are given after the microcrack is formed, the body allows this microcrack to heal, and then the bone adapts to the forces that it has received before, and it becomes stronger and better able to perform at the levels that we have just requested. Where problems can arise during this is when we don't give the bone adequate time to rest and repair and for the microcracks to heal, allowing the bone to get stronger. This can occur through overtraining, or it can occur in some horses where the bone just hasn't developed well enough.
And then with continued exercise, further microcracks develop in the bone, as it has no other way of dissipating the forces of load bearing being applied. Eventually, as these microcracks have no time to heal and new microcracks continue to form, these microcracks begin to coalesce together or join together to form a true crack or fracture of the bone.
So one of my old colleagues, Professor Chris Whitten at the University of Melbourne, in conjunction with Racing Victoria, is probably one of the leading researchers in osteochondral disease and fracture development in horses. And from that research, it would appear that essentially avoidance of fracture development is a gentle balancing act between allowing bone adaptation to occur and giving appropriate rest periods. Both trainers and riders need to accept that microcrack formation is probably a normal part of the bone adaptation process, and it can help us in the long run when appropriate rest is then given for our microcracks to heal and our bone to adapt to the forces that we are expecting it to be able to withstand. Unfortunately, despite all this, information that we're garnering from Professor Witten's excellent research, standardized training protocols that will definitively avoid fracture formation are not available because of all the variables that are present, from the varying types of bone, from, you know, some horses have really rigid bone and are able to withstand fractures better than other horses. Young horses will have different abilities versus older horses, different racing surfaces or competing surfaces. There are a lot of variables out there which prevent us from saying this is the way to train your horse to avoid a fracture developing. But at the same time, there are a few things that we can adapt into our training protocol that will make fracture development much less likely. So if we're planning on using our horses for high energy pursuits like racing or eventing, then it's important that they experience those high energy levels or do that high level work at least once or twice a week, and for shorter periods of work than they would do in other days. As we said, the inclusion of adequate rest periods is important to consider in these horses. So if your horse has been training for weeks to months, well, then they need to get a reasonable rest period at the end of that. And in that case, we're not talking about several days, we're talking about probably several weeks to allow adequate bone resorption and healing to occur and adaptation to complete before progressing with our horses. And pay attention to your horses, because oftentimes these horses will give us clues that something is unwell within them. They'll adopt a different gait, or they might start showing us quite a lot of poor performance, especially in several races or competitions up to the point of fracture. So these subtle signs are often a big warning that trouble is coming. And if we can pick up on them, potentially we can get out ahead of it before our fracture develops. And that's it. Join us next time. We're going to discuss the difference between a fracture and a break. Thanks.